The saloon lanterns flickered against the wooden walls, casting long shadows that danced like restless ghosts of the frontier. Her voice cut through the smoky air, sharp with pain disguised as defiance. "You only like me because I'm alone." The words hung heavy, echoing the truth of countless nights where loneliness was mistaken for love, and survival was confused with affection. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the clink of a glass set down too hard and the creak of boots on old floorboards. He looked at her then, not with anger, not with denial, but with a weight that carried more than words. His reply came low, steady, and unshaken, each syllable like an oath forged in fire. "No, without you I'm nothing." In that instant, the noise of the saloon, the laughter, the cards, the drunken boasts, seemed to fade into dust. Only their voices remained, suspended in the raw space between confession and truth, between fear of abandonment and the desperate need to be seen. In the Old West, where life was measured by the pull of a trigger and the turn of a card, such vulnerability was rarer than gold. Men did not speak of dependence. They spoke of conquest, of land and cattle and victories won. To admit that another soul held the weight of your existence was not weakness. It was dangerous, exposing a wound the land itself might exploit. Yet here was a cowboy who carried scars of solitude, laying bare his heart in a world that valued silence over sincerity. Her breath caught, not from disbelief, but from the terrifying possibility that he meant it. Could it be that beneath the dust, the gunpowder, and the loneliness, there was someone who saw her as more than a passing shadow in his story? His words did not seek to cage her. They revealed his own chains, the truth that without her, the emptiness of the prairie stretched endlessly within him. And that truth shook her more than any promise of love ever could. Thus begins their tale, not with a kiss, nor with a vow sealed by the stars, but with a collision of doubt and confession. A woman convinced she was loved only for her solitude, and a man who admitted that her presence was the only thing that kept him whole. In the unforgiving land of the West, where legends were born of blood and silence, their story would be carved not from desire alone, but from the raw, unflinching truth of what it means to need someone more than you fear losing them. The words hung between them, like the smoke from the saloon lamps, refusing to fade. She had spoken in defiance, trying to shield herself from disappointment, but his reply had cut through her armor. "Without you I'm nothing." It was not the kind of line meant to charm or seduce. It carried too much weight, too much truth, spoken by a man who had walked too long in silence. In that moment, she felt the air grow heavy, as if the whole room waited for her answer. She looked at him, her chest tight with disbelief. Men in the West rarely admitted to needing anyone. They needed whiskey, guns, and land, but never a soul to hold them together. That was weakness, and weakness could get you killed faster than a bullet. Yet there he stood, with eyes that did not flinch, shoulders carrying a burden she had never seen him share. He had been a man of few words, but now each one struck with the force of a confession. Her instinct was to run, to laugh it off, to dismiss his words as desperation. But something inside her hesitated. She had lived through loneliness long enough to recognize its shadow in others. His solitude mirrored her own, raw and restless, carved by years of battles with silence and storms. She saw in him not a cowboy chasing a fleeting comfort, but a man stripped bare of pride, daring to risk humiliation for the chance of truth. The saloon around them blurred into insignificance. The music of cards shuffling, boots stomping, and laughter echoing seemed to fade. All that mattered was the fire in his voice and the unspoken plea hidden beneath his words. She wondered if she could trust him, or if trust was just another trap the West liked to set for the weary-hearted. But the thought lingered. Maybe he wasn't using her solitude. Maybe he was revealing his own. That night, long after the saloon emptied, the weight of his words followed her into the darkness. They pressed against her chest like an unanswered question. Could someone in the Old West, scarred by hunger and hardened by loss, truly believe that without her, he was nothing? Or was it simply another illusion, destined to dissolve with the sunrise? The days that followed did little to ease her doubts. Life on the frontier was unrelenting, and every dawn was another battle for survival. Yet his words refused to leave her, echoing with every glance he gave her, every silence that felt more like confession than avoidance. She watched him closely as he repaired fences, broke wild horses, and faced the merciless rhythm of the land. And though he never repeated the words, she saw them written in the way his gaze lingered, the way his silence seemed to hold a weight that words could not. He was not a man who sought her with empty gestures. Instead, he sought her presence in the small things. When storms rolled across the horizon, he always glanced to see if she was near. When hunger bit at their camp, he gave her the larger portion, pretending not to notice his own ribs showing. In every act, she saw not conquest but quiet proof. Perhaps he had meant what he said. Perhaps his survival was no longer just about himself. Still, fear gnawed at her. She had heard sweet words before, words that crumbled under the pressure of hunger and bloodshed. Could he truly believe she was the anchor that kept him standing? Or was she merely the closest soul in a land where loneliness devoured even the strongest men? She wrestled with these questions as the nights grew colder, her heart torn between disbelief and the fragile pull of hope. One evening, as the fire flickered low, she finally asked him, her voice sharp to mask her trembling. "Do you even know what it means to say that without me, you're nothing? Do you know what weight those words carry?" He looked at her then, his face lit by the glow of the flames, his eyes stripped of every shield. "I know because I lived as nothing before you. The land gave me silence, the storms gave me scars, but you," his voice faltered for the first time, "you gave me a reason." Her breath caught. She wanted to deny it, to turn her face from the raw truth in his eyes. But deep inside, a piece of her soul, scarred, hardened, yet still alive, recognized the sincerity. In a land where promises often meant nothing, his vow was beginning to feel like the one thing that might outlive the storms. The prairie stretched wide and merciless, yet it was not the horizon that unsettled her. It was his words that clung to her soul. Each mile they rode together, she tried to bury them, to remind herself that the West was no place for fragile confessions. And yet, the way he looked at her, steady and unflinching, made it impossible to dismiss. A man could lie with charm, with laughter, even with vows whispered in the dark, but his eyes carried no trick. They carried emptiness, yes, but also a fire sparked only when she was near. She tested him in silence, watching for cracks. When danger stirred on the road, she waited to see if his instinct would be to protect only himself. But each time, without hesitation, he placed her behind him, as though his body existed only as a shield between her and the cruelty of the land. When supplies ran low, he gave without being asked, without seeking gratitude. And when the nights grew colder, he tended the fire longer than needed, his eyes never drifting from her silhouette against the flames. These were not gestures of conquest. They were proof of something heavier, something lived rather than spoken. Still, her doubts clung like shadows. In the Old West, loneliness was as common as dust, and desperate men often mistook it for love. Could he truly separate his need for survival from his need for her? She turned the question over and over, fearing that his words were not love, but hunger. Hunger for warmth, hunger for company, hunger for anything that kept the silence from consuming him whole. And yet, each time her doubts sharpened, his quiet acts chipped at their edge. One night, unable to contain the storm in her chest, she spoke. "If I walked away tomorrow, what would you do?" Her voice cracked, half daring, half begging him to prove her wrong. He looked at her for a long time, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying the weight of battles unseen. "Then I would ride on," he said softly, "but I would leave myself behind with you." The words burned into her, painful and tender, and she hated how much they unsettled her heart. She lay awake long after, staring at the endless sky. His voice replayed in her mind, weaving itself into her doubts. The West was cruel, yes, but cruelty could not fabricate sincerity. And in her bones, for the first time, she began to wonder if his truth was real, that without her, he was nothing, not because she filled his loneliness, but because she awakened a part of him he thought the land had buried forever. The days grew heavier with tension, not only from their unspoken bond, but from the danger circling them. Rumors traveled faster than wind across the plains, and whispers of bandits in the region reached their ears. The woman felt her fear rise again, wondering if his vow would fracture under the weight of bloodshed. Words were fragile things when faced with bullets, and the West had a way of testing every promise. They found themselves riding into a valley at dusk, the canyon walls towering above, shadows crawling with the coming night. She sensed danger before it appeared, the unnatural silence, the way the horses grew restless. Then, from the rocks, riders emerged, guns glinting, laughter sharp as knives. Her chest tightened. This was the moment, the kind of trial that stripped away masks. Will he still stand by her when the cost could be his life? The cowboy's hand moved to his revolver, his eyes calm but fierce. He turned briefly to her, not with panic, not with hesitation, but with a look that steadied her heart. "Stay close," he murmured. Then, facing the outlaws, he spoke with the steady voice of a man who knew the stakes. "You want me? Fine, but you won't touch her." His words were not shouted. They were forged, iron against fire. And in that moment, she saw the truth of his vow. Not desire, not loneliness, but devotion strong enough to bleed for. The outlaws laughed, circling like vultures, but his stillness made them falter. He was one man against many, yet his resolve carried more weight than their numbers. And when the first shot split the night, his body moved like a storm unleashed, every strike not just for himself, but for her. She realized, heart pounding, that he was not trying to prove his words. He was living them, each bullet, each breath, each unyielding stance a testament to his truth. And as chaos erupted in the canyon, she felt her doubts shatter. This was not a man who clung to her out of hunger. This was a man who had found her the one thing the West could never give, a reason. And that reason was worth more to him than land, than pride, than even his life. The canyon erupted with fire and steel. Gunshots echoed against the walls, each blast magnified until it felt like thunder shaking the earth itself. The cowboy's movements were sharp, precise, born from years of surviving the unforgiving frontier. Every shot he fired was measured, not wild desperation, but calm determination. She crouched low behind a boulder, her heart pounding like a war drum, yet her eyes never left him. In that storm of violence, she saw not just a fighter, but a man who stood because of the vow he had spoken. The outlaws were more than a handful. They were many, their numbers enough to overwhelm any lone rider. Yet he fought not as one against many, but as one who refused to surrender. When his revolver emptied, he swung the butt like a hammer, striking down the nearest man before reloading with unshaken rhythm. Dust filled the air, men shouted curses, horses reared, but through the chaos, his focus never strayed from one truth. She would not be touched. Fear clawed at her throat, but something else rose with it. Rage. She remembered every sneer, every whisper, every hand that had once reduced her to nothing but desire. And now, with a knife gripped tight in her hand, she felt that same fire awaken inside her. When one outlaw lunged close, she didn't flinch. She drove the blade forward, the force of survival and defiance pushing it deeper than fear ever could. The man fell back, stunned not by the wound, but by the realization that she was not prey. She was flame. The cowboy caught her movement in the corner of his eye, and pride flashed across his face even as he fought. For in that single act, she had broken free of the chains her doubts had forged. She was no longer questioning whether his vow was real. She was proving her own strength, matching his honor with her courage. Side by side, even in the chaos, they were no longer separate. They were bound by something greater than fear. When the dust finally settled, bodies lay scattered across the canyon floor. The survivors fled into the night, their courage shattered, their laughter silenced. The cowboy stood bloodied but unbroken, his revolver heavy in his hand. She rose slowly from behind the boulder, her knife still dripping, her chest heaving with breathless disbelief. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and in that gaze, no words were needed. They had fought not as savior and saved, but as equals, bound by a truth that had survived the test of fire. The silence after the battle was deafening, broken only by the wind whispering through the canyon walls. The cowboy wiped the blood from his brow, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. though exhaustion weighed on him. She approached cautiously, the knife still clenched in her trembling hand. For the first time, she looked at herself not as the woman who had whispered, "You only like me because I'm alone," but as someone who had stood her ground. And in her reflection, she saw that his words had never been chains. They had been a mirror showing her what she had forgotten she could be. He turned to her, his voice raw from battle, but unwavering. "I told you. Without you, I'm nothing." It was not a plea, nor an attempt to bind her with guilt. It was truth, spoken with the same gravity as the bullets he had fired. She felt the sting of tears, not from weakness, but from the weight of finally believing. For in his eyes, she was not a possession, not a shadow to fill his loneliness. She was the fire that had given him purpose again, the reason he still drew breath. She knelt beside him, tending to the wound at his arm, her hands gentle but firm. "And without you," she whispered, her voice shaking as though the words themselves were heavier than any burden she had carried. "Without you, I fear I would still be lost." It was her confession, the one she had buried under doubt and defiance. And as it left her lips, the canyon seemed to hold the truth in its silence, echoing it against the stone walls as if to etch it into memory. For the first time, she did not see herself as a woman bound by scars or by solitude. She saw herself as part of something larger, something that defied the cruelty of the West. Together, they had faced death and chosen to stand. Together, they had proven that needing someone did not mean weakness. It meant strength forged through trust, stronger than the chains of pride or fear. As night fell over the battlefield, they built a small fire amid the ashes. The flames flickered weakly, but to her, it was the brightest she had ever seen. In its light, she understood. The West would test them again, with storms, with hunger, with blood. But the bond they had forged would endure, not because of loneliness, but because of truth. And truth, in the Old West, was rarer than gold, and far more powerful. The horizon stretched before them in endless silence, the kind that gnawed at a person's spirit more than any outlaw's bullet. They rode side by side, battered from the canyon fight, but something unspoken lingered between them now. Her doubts, once sharp as thorns, had dulled. She no longer questioned if his words were hollow, for he had carved their truth into the dust with blood and fire. Yet belief came with its own burden. To accept that without her, he was nothing, meant she had to face the weight of what she had become to him. That night, under a sky littered with stars, she stared into the fire and let the silence grow heavy. At last, she spoke. "What if one day I fail you? What if I'm not enough?" Her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the terror of realizing she mattered more than she ever dared to. He turned to her, his gaze steady, carrying the same fire he had shown on the battlefield. "You cannot fail me," he said softly, "because it is not what you do for me that makes me live. It is who you are." His words pierced her deeper than any blade, unraveling the last shield she held. For the first time, she let herself cry, not from pain, but from the release of years spent believing she was only ever wanted in solitude, only ever valued as a shadow filling someone else's emptiness. The cowboy did not move to quiet her or cage her tears. He simply sat close enough that his presence was steady, grounding her like the earth beneath her feet. And as her tears fell, she realized that this, too, was honor, to let her break and still see her as whole. The West, cruel and relentless, offered no mercy for hearts laid bare. But in that moment, by the flicker of the flames, she discovered that vulnerability could be fiercer than steel. His vow was not chains, it was freedom, because it gave her space to be both strong and broken, both scarred and alive. And that freedom was rarer than water in the desert, more precious than gold hidden in the hills. By dawn, when the fire had burned down to embers, she no longer whispered the words of doubt that had once defined her. She carried his vow on her chest like a brand, painful, heavy, but unshakable. She understood now that love in the West was not spoken in promises of safety, for safety never lasted. It was spoken in defiance of fear, in choosing each other even when the land tried to tear them apart. Their journey led them into the heart of a town simmering with unrest. The people were restless, tensions rising over land disputes and the rule of lawless men who fed on fear. Whispers of their stand in the canyon had traveled faster than the dust, and eyes followed them as they passed through the main street. To her surprise, those eyes did not see her as they once had. There was no sneer, no mocking whisper of weakness. They looked at her with something else, recognition, the kind of respect only earned in fire. But respect bred danger, and it wasn't long before the same outlaws they had faced returned with reinforcements, eager to reclaim their pride. One evening, as the townsfolk gathered near the saloon, the outlaws rode in, their laughter sharp, their guns glinting beneath the fading sun. The woman felt her heart race, but this time, she did not shrink behind the cowboy. She stepped forward, her voice strong enough to cut through the noise. "You came for shadows," she declared, "but I am no shadow. I am flame, and if you touch what is mine, you will burn." Her words silenced the square. The outlaws sneered, mocking her defiance, but the crowd stirred, emboldened by her fire. For in a land where silence had long been the rule of survival, her voice became a spark, igniting something that had been waiting to rise. The cowboy stood at her side, saying nothing, because her strength did not need his voice. It needed only his presence, unwavering as stone. When the first outlaw reached for his gun, the townsfolk moved too, as if her courage had broken the chains of their fear. The clash that followed was not just a fight, it was a reckoning. The cowboy's revolver roared, the woman's blade flashed, and for the first time, the town itself rose against its tormentors. Blood stained the dust, but when the echoes faded, it was the outlaws who lay broken, their laughter forever silenced. In the aftermath, the people looked not only at the cowboy as a hero, but at her, with awe, with reverence. She had begun as a woman who believed she was loved only because she was alone, but now she was something far greater. She was proof that honor could forge strength from scars, that fire could rise from ashes, and that even in the cruelest land, truth could outlive fear. And the cowboy, bloodied but unbowed, stood beside her not as her savior, but as her equal, bound forever by the vow that had defied the West itself. The town settled into uneasy quiet after the blood dried on its streets. Whispers of what had happened spread like wildfire, carried from one saloon to another, from ranch hands to drifters. They spoke of the cowboy who fought with fire in his eyes, but more than that, they spoke of the woman who stood beside him, unbroken, fierce, a flame no outlaw could smother. She had become a story in her own right, no longer defined by solitude, but by the strength that had grown from her scars. That night, as they rested in a room above the saloon, she stared out the window at the horizon. The world still stretched cruel and vast, and she knew the battles were far from over. But now, when she thought of his words, "Without you I'm nothing," they no longer weighed on her as chains. Instead, they settled inside her like truth, fierce and undeniable. For she had seen it herself, in the way he fought, in the way he lived. Without her, he was a man wandering, hollow. With her, he was whole. She turned to him, the flicker of lamplight softening the harsh lines of his face. He bore fresh scars from the battle, reminders of the price he had paid to keep his vow. Quietly, she reached out, her hand brushing his. "And without you," she whispered, "I might still believe I was nothing." The confession hung in the air, raw and dangerous, yet freeing. For it was the first time she admitted aloud what her heart had long known, that his vow had not only saved her life, but had given it meaning. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw no triumph, no pride, only reverence. Then together, he said softly, "We are everything." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of the West itself, unshaken, unyielding. For in a land where loneliness had broken so many, they had found not conquest, but connection. And that connection was stronger than the hunger of the desert, stronger than the cruelty of men who thrived on fear. The fire between them was not born of fleeting desire. It was forged in honor, in blood, in the endless struggle against the emptiness of the frontier. And as the wind howled outside, carrying with it the ghosts of all who had fallen to solitude, she understood. Their bond was no longer a question. It was a legend already writing itself into the dust. The weeks that followed wove their names into the fabric of the West. Wherever they rode, whispers trailed behind them, not of a lone cowboy or a scarred woman, but of two souls bound together by truth. The prairie had seen countless stories of betrayal, conquest, and loss, but theirs was different. It was not about survival alone. It was about defiance, about choosing each other against a world that demanded they walk alone. She carried herself differently now. No longer did she bow her head when men tried to measure her worth in shadows. No longer did she whisper, "You only like me because I'm alone." Instead, she walked with fire in her eyes, the kind that came from knowing she was seen, honored, and irreplaceable. And when others doubted, when whispers of her past threatened to surface, the cowboy's vow silenced them. His presence at her side, steady as stone, was proof enough. Together, they faced storms that bent trees to the ground, droughts that turned rivers into dust, and the endless hostility of a land that gave nothing for free. Yet with each trial, they grew stronger, their bond a shield no outlaw, no storm, no silence could break. For in each hardship, his words lived again, not as fragile promises, but as truths carved into every act. And she, once broken by doubt, answered his vow with her own, not in words, but in the unshaken fire of her presence beside him. The West had taken many things from them both, peace, safety, innocence, but could not take what they had built together. Because their bond was not a fleeting comfort born of loneliness. It was defiance carved into the bones of the earth itself. It was a fire that burned long after the dust settled, long after the echoes of gunfire faded into silence. And so their legend was born. A cowboy who declared, "Without you, I'm nothing," and a woman who proved that truth in every step she took beside him. Not a story of weakness, nor of chains, but of two souls who found in each other the strength to stand against the merciless West. A story whispered in saloons, carried by the wind across the plains, and etched forever into the memory of a land that had once tried to break them both. The West was never gentle. It broke the strong, buried the brave, and turned countless promises into dust. Yet within its cruel vastness, their story rose. A woman who believed she was valued only in her solitude, and a cowboy who confessed that without her, he was nothing. Through blood, storms, and silence, they learned that truth spoken in vulnerability can be fiercer than any weapon. Their journey was not about escaping loneliness, but about transforming it into connection, a connection that defied a land built to swallow souls whole. She had carried her scars as proof of her insignificance, but in his eyes, those scars became symbols of survival. He had walked the earth as though emptiness was his only companion, yet in her, he found a reason to stand and fight. Together, they showed that honor is not found in conquest, but in reverence, not in taking, but in protecting. Their bond was not weakness. It was the truest form of strength, forged in the fire of a land where nothing came without cost. What remains unforgettable is not the battles they fought, nor the blood they spilled, but the choice they made each day. In a world that demanded isolation, they chose each other. In a place where loneliness was expected, they built a bond that endured. That choice reminds us all that sometimes the bravest act is not pulling the trigger or standing alone. It is admitting that another soul makes us whole. And in that admission, there is no weakness, only power. Their legend lingers not in the echo of gunfire, but in the whisper of the wind across the plains. Without you, I am nothing. It is a reminder that the West, as merciless as it was, could not erase truth when it was carved in honor. And as their story passed through saloons and campfires, it became more than memory. It became a mirror, daring others to ask, who do we stand for, and who stands for us? If this story stirred something in you, let it live beyond this moment. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice keeps these legends alive. And if you wish to keep riding through tales where the Old West bleeds hardship and hope in equal measure, subscribe to the channel and leave your mark with a like. Together, we keep the fire burning, ensuring that stories of honor, love, and survival continue to echo across the horizon long after the last shot is fired.